So, guys, I want to talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I do want to mention that I really love old movies and I also like very controversial films. So, the other day, August 18, was Texas Chainsaw Massacre Day because the setting of the movie takes place in the 70s on August 18. And there is a lot of things that I have to talk about. And, pardon like the shitty room and everything like that, really. I have neighbors that are having a cookout outside and now they're actually using a chainsaw to cut down some trees or whatever. Maybe they're just trying to find some firewood or whatever. So, obviously they're just noisy motherfuckers, really. But I really want to start reviewing this film, and I really want to say that, first of all, this is one of the greatest films ever made. It's definitely great for the horror genre. It has excellent cinematography, it has excellent directing, storytelling. The editing has its ups and downs, has great sound design and other things like that. So I want to just break down the film. That first of all, the opening of the film starts with a summary of events. Really, like that. There was a tragedy. A couple of people died, and it was an event called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And a bunch of people say that it's actually a reference to the Vietnam War because what happened during that time was that there were a lot of news stations reporting events from the Vietnam War, and some of them were accurate and some of them were inaccurate. And the other part of that is also that there were more violent news stories at that time because more people were watching the news. This was after the Hays Code, where in the '60s they got rid of the Hays Code, which was that you could do more violence and sexuality in movies and also in other types of media because before then the Catholic Church and other religious groups were in charge of rating systems. So they said, okay, you can't do these things. So in the 70s, there was more violence and it was more like acceptable, really. This is 74, so The Godfather came out in 72. You had you've had a bunch of very violent films at this time, like The Wild Bunch, Straw Dogs, A Clockwork Orange, and a couple other ones as well, really. So violence in media was starting to become, acceptable. So the movie starts out with a group of teenagers going through Texas, and what happens is that they actually just want to investigate an issue with grave robbing. And the opening of the film is actually really crazy because you also see a graveyard with no. First of all, what you see is a bunch of dead bodies, and they're all like decayed and everything like that. And you hear like camera shots, so it's kind of like it kind of has that element of mystery. Like you're saying, okay, we know this massacre is going to happen, but how do we get to this point? So it gives you a sense of intrigue, and it also gives you a sense of danger. Like something very bad's going to happen, really, and there's also this really cool shot of a graveyard with like a dead body hanging on a crucifix, and then also too, you see like it all like really yellowish, and you see like a bunch of fog. Really, like, it's like out of a nightmare, or it looks very like something out of like a spaghetti western with the good, the bad, the ugly, where you saw those large graveyards. It has a look of like a nightmare or an adult version of a Tim Burton thing. So it kind of is almost like is there a supernatural element to this? Like what's really the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Is Leatherface a real person, or is he like Freddy Krueger, where he is like a mystical force? Really, it kind of gives you an element of like how do we get to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Is it a supernatural thing? Is it a mystery thing? What? How do you put that together, really? So I like how in the beginning of the film it gives you a sense of intrigue, and then also it's a very dark yellow, but they establish later on that that's just what the sunrises and sunsets look in Texas, really. So when you first see it, you're like, that doesn't feel natural, all these desaturated strong yellow colors, but then later on you're like, okay, that's natural to sunrises and sunsets. So what happens is then you see like these teenagers ride through Texas. They're trying to investigate, what's going on, really. And then what happens is that they go through Texas, and they pick up a hitchhiker. And what happened was that the hitchhiker like takes a knife, and what he does is that he cuts himself a little bit, and then he cuts Franklin, who's the guy in the wheelchair, and they all get really freaked out by this. And what I kind of said before is that that this happens in Texas. So one of the themes of this film is, is hippie culture. And what I mean by this is that back in the 1970s, there were people getting out of that hippie phase. But in the 60s, there were a lot of people traveling west, a lot of teenagers, a lot of young people. And what happened was a lot of them got took advantage of. So sometimes what would usually happen is they would be homeless. A person would give them like cocaine and other drugs. They'd get hooked on it, and then they'd sell them into prostitution. The more you fuck, the more drugs you get, really. And also they would get robbed or beaten up or whatever, or sometimes assaulted or robbed violently. So I really think that this is kind of a reminder of that. Like, oh, you hear these young kids going out west. They're very, very trusting, and they're very, like, hospitable, and they're very open to people, just like many hippies were, really. And there was also the free love movement, which means you give your body to other people, really, or you're sexually open. And there are a lot of people who suffered from STDs or other things like that because they have that naivety of the hippie culture of, if you're like I said, if you're open to anybody, you're open to like their trouble, really. Or like they say, the easiest person to conquer is somebody who's too nice, really. So I think that's a reference to that. And then later on, they find this house, and it's said that like Franklin, his grandfather owns a property. His father and grandfather owns a property, so I think they think it's his property. So you see a bunch of people. So they all kind of park, and then you see like Kurt and Pam just like explore the house, really, and just like check it out a little bit. So what happens is that Pam and Kirk, they want to go like they both want to go like swimming together, find a swimming hole, and then Pam goes into a house, really. So with them, like, they're kind of holding hands, they want to go to a swimming hole. So it's kind of reference to like what I said about the free love culture, where they're like, okay, they want to have sex, they want to like possibly go to the swimming hole, skinny dip, whatever. That was normal back then. And now they're kind of like, have this naivety of, okay, here's an abandoned house. They're actually told by a gas station owner, don't go on people's properties, and whatever, really. So Pam goes in. So what happens is that Pam goes into no, what happens is Pam goes into the house first, I believe, if I remember correctly. And she gets like kidnapped by Leatherface, And what happens is that it's a really scary shot because you see her go into the house, and as she's walking, you kind of see her like her ass, and then it shows it's like a low angle shot. So you see like her walking, you see like her red shorts and her tight ass, giggity giggity, oh rat, giggity giggity, and then you also see like the Texas sun, and you see like the sky, really, and it's all cloudy and beautiful. It looks very, very beautiful. And then also too, outside the place, really, you see all these really beautiful green plants, really. And there's also a lot of these very beautiful shots of Texas. Like, honestly, they had so much diversity of different shots, really. It really felt like Midnight Cowboy, The Days of Heaven, and almost like a travel video, almost. Like, I really think this is kind of a multi-genre. This is almost like a travel video and a horror film and a mystery film and a psychological horror and other things like that. So she goes in, she gets kidnapped by Leatherface, and the inside of the house, like, you see a lot of like desaturated colors. It's very reminiscent of the artwork of Francis Bacon, like desaturated colors, strong reds, strong blacks. A lot of shapes and textures stand out, really. So she gets kidnapped by Leatherface. And then later on, Kirk goes inside the house. He's killed with a hammer. And she's also hung on a meat hook. So you see a couple of things with this. That first of all, when Kirk gets hit with a hammer, it's not really that graphic. And he also gets cut up with a chainsaw. So, you don't really see all that violence. They do a good job in this film of, like, what happens, but they don't need to kind of be in graphic detail or very in your face with the violence. A lot of it happens off camera, or a lot of it is done in ways where it's almost like they give you enough, but they don't give you everything, really, and that's kind of the strength of the movie. And then also, Pam is hung from a meat hook, and you actually don't see the her flesh going into the hook, really, but But yeah, it's definitely really grisly, and it's almost like it almost throws you off a little bit because there's a lot of like dresses that women have with like a tied top on the bottom, really like a strap on the bottom to like hold their the hold like to hold it up really. So when I first watched the film, I was like, oh well, I thought that it wasn't actually going into her body, but it was going into her body really. So that's definitely very like grisly really. And then I also just like this as well really because you expect him to get ripped apart by a chainsaw, but they don't give you that right away really. They build to that because in good films, in good horror films, they build to these moments. They don't just kind of go extreme at the beginning really. And then I also like this because I'm not sure how long this is into the film. It's like 20 or 30 minutes, and that's also good storytelling because if you gave everything at the beginning, it would get kind of repetitive, really. So this movie just relies heavily on suspense, making you feel like, okay, you know what, the disaster is coming, but how do we get to that disaster, really? So very good storytelling. Then later on, Jerry comes down and starts looking for them because it's getting close to nighttime. So what happens is Jerry comes down. He opens like a freezer because he opens like a freezer and then he sees like Pam inside the freezer and Pam comes down. She's kind of like scared and whatever really is. Then Jerry gets killed with a hammer. And then like Leatherface just like like presses on the freezer door and then Pam can't get out. And I'm not sure if it's one of those freezer doors where and this was old refrigerators. Like old refrigerators you could not get out. Someone has to let you out. And sometimes freezers are like that too, really. But also she's been there for a long time. And then, the way that some people die is there's two ways. There's a couple of they don't tell you if she died or not. In the movie, they don't like directly show it to you, but it's kind of implied that she died, and it makes sense that she did because obviously her body was in a hook for a long time, really. Like so she probably died of blood loss. The other thing too is that she was in a freezer in a tight space, so there could have been suffocation. And then she was also in a freezer for the entire film. The film is like it takes place over a period of like 2 days, really. So when you do something like that, like obviously like in a freezer for like 2 days, you die of hypothermia, and also like blood loss, and also when you're in a cramped spot like that, obviously that's bad for your body to be in a cramped position, really. So more than likely she died. And then what happens is that you have the two remaining people, which is Franklin and Sally. So what happens is that they go to the house and they go by the house, and then what happens is Leatherface, runs up to them and he kills Franklin with a chainsaw. But they do a really, really great job of when he's being cut. They don't actually show it, but they do enough to actually make you kind of be like, oh wow, wow, this is really fucked up, really. But again, it's good because it's a low budget film, so they did enough to kind of make you know that it's happening without just being in grisly and graphic detail. The other thing about it is the sound design, and the sound design is excellent because you hear a lot of screaming. There's a lot of off-camera stuff, where honestly, like when people are being killed, you hear somebody in the background reacting and screaming as somebody else is being killed in front of them. But what I've seen in a lot of films or in a lot of bad movies is that somebody is off camera, they don't make a sound, but usually what you do in good films is that, okay, if somebody's witnessing something and the person that's witnessing something is off camera, they have to react, and them screaming and reacting in horror to something adds to the unsettling vibe. And it adds to the sound design element of this because obviously, screaming and yelling, how other people are reacting within the environment is all very important to establishing tone. And then also, then now it's just Sally. So there's a lot of good sequences with her being chased by Leatherface with a chainsaw. So what happens is that she's stuck in shrubs, really. So there's a scene where she's being chased, and then she manages to run away and enter a gas station, and the gas station owner is actually he helps her out a little bit, and then what happens is that actually it's all like a ruse, really. So he's actually one of the He's actually part of the Sawyer family, which is, Leatherface and then the hitchhiker. So what happens is this kind of goes back to what I've said before about about being too trusting, really, and also naivety, because he told them don't go exploring on other people's property. He gave them a chance to just walk away, really, and because he's psychotic, really, now she has to pay the price for it, and it's almost like a sense of like, okay, you know what, I gave you, at least I gave you a way out of this. So, he beats her with a broom and then he brings her back to the place, really. And then what happens is that back at the home, they tie her up, really. And then you actually see the older, you see the gas station owner, the gas owner. I'm going to call him the gas owner. Like, so he's the older brother. So the gas owner, he beats Leatherface, who's like his younger brother, because, he damaged the door. And he also blames Leatherface for everything that's going on, really, because he's kind of like, you know what, you shouldn't have damaged the door. You shouldn't have been killing people. You drew attention, and they don't want attention because obviously they're a family of cannibals. They want to just live off their property, not have the police or other people involved or whatever. They just want to make sure they don't go under anybody's radar. And then also the other scary thing too about this film is that this takes place in Texas, because Texas is the third biggest state, and it's very, very desolate. So especially back then, you can get away with anything really down there because it's so desolate. People wouldn't really know what's going on and stuff like that. So it was just a way. This could be going on, but this is so far away from. You can have neighbors that are miles away, really. So honestly, nobody can hear you scream, really. If somebody's killed with a chainsaw or a tree falls in Texas, it doesn't make a sound, really. That type of thing. So he beats Leatherface, and this is kind of like another element of what I want to talk about. One of the other themes is domestic violence, really. Because obviously in situations of domestic violence, it can raise psychopathic tendencies, really. And then you also got to wonder, because they're I think it's their grandfather, the father, is in a catatonic state. And maybe he was kind of abusive to them. And then also they grew up around a lot of violence, because he was like saying, oh, well, the older man, who I believe is in my notes, the grandpa, grandpa, and with grandpa, he might have taught them how to kill animals. He might have even he may have been violent and abusive to him. But it's also the other thing too of, if you are a butcher, maybe you shouldn't teach your kids how to do butchery stuff ever. Or maybe when they're teenagers or they're a little bit older, if they want to get into the family business, that's when you show them. So it almost is like, a statement about domestic violence and families that grow up around violence. Because obviously Leatherface has a mental disorder, and he might have some form of low IQ or mental retardation. But also he could have been severely abused. And usually people who are who are abused very severely are very submissive. There's Stockholm syndrome. And there's also maybe a sense of, and they also said something about like Leatherface, like he is almost like the mom character, because he cooks, he does all the housework, he wears the apron, and he's also like goes out and like cooks and whatever, really. So he's almost like the mom to these two other brothers, really. And he also takes their abuse, really, because a lot of like domestic violence relationships, stereotypically, it's the man being the woman. So all that shaped Leatherface's psyche, and maybe these guys are all reacting because maybe their grandpa or their parents were abusive to them, really. So it's almost like, passing down that type of behavior. And then also because they work in because maybe slaughterhouses and killing is in the family business, killing animals and killing people, there could be a sense of, how should I kind of say this? There could be a sense of passing down that type of behavior and everything like that, really. So there are statements of how a person's psyche and how a person's behavior is shaped by domestic violence. The next thing that I want to share is, before I forget, that when they're back, when Sally's at the gas station before she gets brought to the house, what happens is that you hear a lot of news stories. So it kind of goes down to what we've said about more violence in media. Like, this film, it really is about a world with more and more and more violence. So, so that's important as well, really. And then also, again, there's also violence here, really. So maybe it's also like, when people talk about violence, and when there's violence in media and there's violence everywhere, it can inspire people to be more violent, really. Because that's one of the reasons why they say with children, that's why you don't watch the news. Or I remember like when I was a kid in the '90s, sometimes my parents would be like, "Okay, the O.J. Simpson case is on. You guys go to bed. This is not kid stuff, or really." My dad was like that Hank Hill type. Because sometimes there was a lot of shielding of people from violence, really, as like especially the '70s. Because television wasn't as big, really. So a lot of people like say, "Okay, you can't watch; it's too violent." Or there's some people who would turn off news stories when their kids are listening because of violence. So maybe like hearing all these violent stories was trying to say maybe America's more violent, or there's violence everywhere, really. Another theme that I want to talk about is Southern culture, because this film's also considered a Hicksploitation film. So, like I was saying before, that there is a stereotype of Southern hospitality. Like Southern people are very hospitable. They're nice. They're kind. They're friendly. They don't just send you home with barbecue. They send you home with rib tips and other things like that. Really, they send you with everything but the kitchen sink. Or like you see in King of the Hill, where the Canadians move to the Hill neighborhood, and then they get a mug from Hank, and Hank is like, okay, bring the mug back when you're ready, like Southern hospitality. And this film turns it on its head, really, because it shows like Southern people as dangerous because of Leatherface, the old gas station owner who's also sells barbecue, and and the hitchhiker. Like it shows that Southern people are not like that. And then it also has the stereotype of Southern people being a bunch of dumb rednecks and whatever, really. And then I also kind of say it also shows the hypocrisy of Southern culture. Because if you remember that there were a lot of like rallies, like there was like the Little Rock Nine, where there would be signs like, um, there'd be like signs like, keep these niggers out of like our school, whatever. 2468, we don't want to integrate. And then also there are a lot of Martin Luther King rallies where people are saying, we want King, we want King. Or there are posters saying, okay, I remember seeing a poster saying, kiss me, I'm integrated. It shows like a black person, like as a hybrid of a black person and an ape, really. Or a lot of like Martin Luther King rallies, he would be walking and he would be like crouching every single time he heard a gunshot going off. So maybe this film was also like a statement or an allegory of, well, you think of Southern culture and Southern hospitality, and it's not always like that because of like you look at the civil rights and all the violence that happened to civil rights protesters, and then also that was not just black people. There are also like times where people get shot and lynched, or have their homes burned down, or have their um, buses burned down in the South. Really, if they like freedom riders and other things like that, and that was all groups of people. Or there would be women who were freedom riders who would be beaten and raped, really, because of wanting to promote integration and all that. So maybe this film was kind of like a statement of, okay, you think of Southern culture, it's not the Southern hospitality. There's also a lot of violence in Southern culture. And then also, the director of this film, he was at the University of Texas, and he was a survivor when they had the Texas shooting. Um, I think it was John Whitman, if I'm saying his name correct. Um, if I'm not Walt Whitman, I think it was John Whitman. I think I got the name wrong, but he was the guy who did the shooting at the University of Texas, and I believe what they said was that his close friend, the close friend of the director, was shot in the was shot during the University of Texas sniper shooting. So it does kind of talk about Southern culture, and that if you think about Southern people as these nice, friendly King of the Hill, Hank Hill types, that's not always the case. There is violence in Southern culture, and there's also people who are crazy rednecks. And other things like that. The other thing that I want to mention is that towards the end of the film, Sally does a lot of screaming, really, and it was actually weird because I remember like her running away and screaming, and I thought about the time that when I was a kid, I was in middle school and I was playing outside, and then what happened was we moved to this house. Long story short, there was this dog that chased me. It was like a golden retriever, and I remember like screaming and yelling in the same way because I was freaked out because I got bit by a dog as a little kid. But I remember like I was like 13 years old screaming because I didn't want to be bit and mauled by a dog, really. And my dad being a sociopath, he was like, oh well, Byron is, overreacting, or he's being a drama queen. But it's ultimately like, dogs are territorial. But what happened was the dog, before people moved into the house that we were at, the dog used that as a ground to go to the bathroom, really. So, the dog was, chasing me. And I kind of remembered that I was screaming the same way Sally was, or like that type of like, primal, I'm fearing for my life scream. So I kind of thought about that as well. Like, she did a really good job of screaming in fear. And then I think at the end of the film, she kind of screams because she lost her sanity, really. And at the end of the film, she's the only one who escapes from all that. And one of the final things is that when she's screaming, she kind of runs like this with her hands down. Like, it kind of reminds me of there's this really disturbing picture of this girl in the Vietnam War where her house got struck by a napalm strike. She was running naked, and they said that image of this girl who's running naked, and she's covered with like either fire or like burn scars and napalm. That one, like, that picture won a Pulitzer Prize, and she's still alive, really. But it kind of was like Sally was kind of like, in the same pose, like her arms were down, she was all like screaming, and there's blood going down her leg. It kind of reminded me of that image of that girl running and screaming from a napalm strike during the Vietnam War. So I'm not sure if they got that idea from that, but like that kind of reminded me of that, and that's kind of why I kind of said it is kind of like an allegory to the Vietnam War, because a lot of people heard stories of soldiers, sexually assaulting, or soldiers doing war crimes, or soldiers like doing napalm strikes, or like Full Metal Jacket. You see the soldier with the Gatling gun on the plane. And he's shooting down people for sport, and there's also stories about sometimes in the Vietnam War, what the U.S. would do is that they'll send soldiers to certain areas, and they'll be like, okay, well, there's not a lot of soldiers here, so we do a napalm strike and kill our own people, no problem. Or we will send people out to die, really, because we want a certain advantage, or we want to like test this thing out, really. Like, honestly, it was kind of like there was so much in your face violence in the media of the Vietnam War, and I kind of really think about this. The other thing about it is that insanity is another theme, and I think, like, at the end you see Sally get rescued, and she's screaming, and then she kind of like she's screaming out of fear, and then she kind of like has like a more manic scream. So it's almost like she has like PTSD and trauma, and they drove her insane, really. Like how they did that to transform her from screaming in fear to screaming because she lost her sanity, was done very well, really. And just by screaming as well, like, honestly, they did. It really shows that she lost at the end of it, because it's not just what happened to her physically and what happened to her friends physically, it's what happened to her psychologically as well, really. So, if she survived, more than likely she probably got sent to an insane asylum, and that's the end of it. That's probably like how it ends. If you were to do an epilogue, she got sent to an insane asylum, and she's screaming until the day that she dies, really, or until somebody bashes her on the head, really, or drugs her until she dies, because that's what happened back then in lunatic asylums. They're not that humane, or lobotomy, or whatever, really, or electric shock therapy. So it doesn't. So more than likely, if you analyze it that way, like a possible epilogue, it doesn't end good. But it also talks about insanity, because when you go through nonstop traumatic experiences, you just lose your sanity. Like, I was almost murdered in a store. I worked at a job. It got robbed by its own security guards, and I dealt with a lot of workplace bullying. And I remember sometimes when my boss bullied me or said that he cared about me, I almost thought about falling on the ground and laughing my ass off like Walter White did, because I felt like, I can't believe I'm dealing with this cruelty. I can't believe I'm dealing with this cruelty after I got murdered at my job. I struggled with suicidal thoughts. My parents were telling me to suck it up, get a new job, whatever, really. So obviously when somebody's in consistent danger, that's true, really. They lose their sanity. Like, this film was very, very well researched about how trauma and violence has an influence on people, and how it has an influence on breaking somebody psychologically, really. So insanity is a theme, really. And maybe that's happened to the Sawyer family, where what happened was they went through abuse from the grandpa and abuse from their father and the grandmother. Maybe the three of them abused them, or maybe the father abused them just only, and then the maybe their grandfather, grandmother, and dad, or all of them, or the grandparents and their parents abused them and turned them the way they are. Really, maybe it was the four of them. Maybe it was the four parental figures, the grandparents and the parents, or maybe it was just a combination of a few, or maybe one of them really. But something had to happen to the Sawyer kids to turn them into the way that they are really. The same way Sally turned into somebody who went insane from her traumatic experiences. So that's one element about like how people can become insane by traumatic and violent experiences. And then I also think that another thought about it is like how the world has become more and more insane because definitely you go from this, thoughts of the 1960s, and in the 1960s people thought it was free love and happiness, and then also too you think about the 1950s, people thought about Elvis and and a lot of good times really. Like even though there was a lot of violence in the civil rights movement and there was like domestic violence and other things like that, a lot of television of the 50s and the 60s really shielded a lot of people from a lot of the violence that was going on in the world. But there was a lot of violence if you did your research. The same way in the 90s, a lot of people think it's a very happy and positive time. If you were a kid, you thought it was a happy and a positive time. But if you were an adult, you knew about that even though the Cold War ended, there was still a lot of violence in Africa. There was the Rwanda genocide. There was also Columbine. There was also Bosnia and other countries in Yugoslavia with a lot of violence. The same way in the 50s and 60s, there was there was the Korean War, there was the Vietnam War, there was the Tet Offensive, there was JFK's assassination, RFK, Andy Warhol, almost Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. It was a violent time, but there was a lot of shielding in the 50s and the 60s. So I really think that this film is to say, hey, in the 70s, with more media and more media showing violence in the world, talking about crimes and grisly stuff, you lose sense of the world, really. You lose your sanity. You learn that, okay, the world is not as nice and kind and friendly as you think it is. You almost lose your sanity. And I'll even talk about my childhood. Like I grew up in 2000. I was born in 87. So in 2001, there was September 11th. In during my childhood, you had Dave Chappelle saying the word nigger a lot, which shocked a lot of people because they're like, okay, that was such a taboo thing, and now it's more common. You had shows like Wonder Shows, and which had a bunch of shock value, disturbing, offensive comedy. You saw a lot of news reports like Nancy Grace talking about like babies being microwaved, and just graphic violence everywhere. Like you went from like definitely during my time period, there was a lot of offensive content. There was a lot of like people talking about disturbing stories, really. So when you hear that nonstop, especially as a child, it really fucks with your sanity because you're like, well, I just can't believe just how much there is to this world, and this world is very fucked up and violent and brutal. Like, I work at a hospital, really, and I've been through so many disturbing and fucked up situations that I've seen dead bodies. I've seen dead bodies decompose. I've seen coworkers get assaulted. There were people. I remember cleaning rooms where somebody got a gunshot wound, so I had to clean up like floors covered with blood and just like all that stuff. And it doesn't bother me because I've been through a lot of things in my life, really. Like I'm almost 40 years old. But I can see a younger person, like, having PTSD or quitting the job or being scared to come to work because they don't have that experience. But it almost is like in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like, Sally's character goes insane because she's not been exposed to this level of violence and this over-the-topness. And usually people like that walk away with a form of PTSD or insanity or a mental breakdown. And that's kind of how it ends with her with a mental breakdown, really. And then also, there is a theme of the son. Like, what they're trying to say at the end of the film is that Leatherface is swinging his chainsaw because he wants to kill the son, really. So I really think that's also showing, like, I don't really believe that. I just think that Leatherface is just celebrating his insanity, or he's just, maybe more mad that she got away, and maybe again his world is ending because now she can go report it. Now he has to face consequences from his older brother, who's a gas station owner, and possibly the crazy hick, who was his younger brother. He has to suffer the consequences of them for letting her escape, really. So I really think this film was about people's worlds ending, and that just means that death is how your world ends, really, because it's a change, really. Four of her friends are dead. She went through this very violent experience that is a 1 in a million for an unlucky lottery ticket. There's also injustice because obviously Leatherface and the Sawyer family got away with it because they're not punished for their actions. And I also feel that she was going on an innocent trip through Texas, visiting, doing an investigation, hanging with her friends, and thinking that it's going to be this cool journey, just like hippies traveling west, really. And this is completely opposite of her and what she wanted out of this, or what she believed would happen, really. So it has a way of really fucking with your head, really. Like, oh, well, all this happened to me. How do I process this? The same way when I went to work years ago and I wanted to work hard, save money, do well, buy things, elevate myself, believe in the American dream, and then start a robbery. So, security guard, I was almost murdered by the police, and I suffered from suicidal thoughts and PTSD, and I had mental breakdowns, and I went down a path of self-destruction, really. This film is also about insanity, but also the influence of trauma, really. So, with everything said, I've talked about themes, the writing has elements of foreshadowing, mystery, a lot of different themes about hippie culture, Vietnam War, insanity, loss of innocent, domestic violence, violence in media. The sound design, I've talked about that, really. The editing, I want to talk about the editing a little bit. That I did not like the editing of this film. There was a lot of montages, and there was a lot of speeding of the camera. That's good, but I think the editing suffered because there was a scene at the end where she's being tortured, or Sally's being tortured by the Sawyer family, and they're kind of going crazy, and they're kind of laughing and going crazy. But the problem is that it's unsettling and unnerving. But the problem is if you do that, if you have that go on for a long duration, if you kind of have people do that for minutes upon, if you draw that out way too long, it can come off as comical. There was this film called The Nightingale that I saw 10 years ago, and it shows a rape sequence. And the thing about the rape sequence is that it goes on for minutes upon minutes to show how rape is a very damaging process, how it can last for minutes upon minutes. And people walked out of the movie because they felt that was too much, really, to see a rape sequence drawn out, really. But it did a good job, really, because it was all serious. But you see a bunch of crazy rednecks just kind of going crazy, and they're laughing, and they're being violent and going crazy. I think to some element, because they're kind of making fun of her, they're screaming her screaming, making fun of her screaming. And that going on for a while, it may feel a little bit like black comedy as well, right? It may feel a little bit too cartoonish. So I think the film does suffer from the editing, the editing could have been done a little bit better. I understand some of the ideas, really. There was also this really bad shot of Sally jumping out of the window at the end of the scene. And then when she jumps out, it looks like there was a jump in time, really. She goes from this dark building to it's a little bit brighter outside. And I kind of said that felt like a jump cut. Or that felt a little out of place, really. So you almost had to ask yourself, because she jumped out, it feels like this is a different, place and time. Did she jump out the window? Did she actually die, really? Almost like in Taxi Driver, where there's two endings of the film. One of the endings is that Robert De Niro survives, or Robert De Niro kills himself, and then the ending's almost what he's seeing as he's dying, or in a coma, or it's his heavenly dream, whatever, because he died saving a girl from mobsters, so it's more good than evil, really. Or so maybe Sally dies, and the ending is almost her in a coma state, or in a state of dream before she dies of blood loss, or maybe it's like her body having a dream or a fantasy as she's dead or dying. Because sometimes when you die, people enter a dream state and they enter a fantasy. Sometimes people have talked about that as well, really. So the ending could be that she actually survives, or the ending could be that because they did like a jump cut and there's like a change in like time, really. Um, how is the ending really something that happens, or is that a dream, or is that what she's thinking about as she's dead, really? Like, or is that like her version of heaven is to escape, really? And then I also will say that overall, like, I really love the film. It was great pacing, beautiful film as far as cinematography and art production. Like I said, they found roadkill and other things like that. They really worked with what they had. Really, like, honestly, this is one of the greatest films ever made. Um, I would say even in my films, I would say The Deer Hunter, Midnight Cowboy is my favorite film. The Deer Hunter's on that list. Definitely, like, I like Last Tango in Paris with the cinematography. The noir anime series, it's not a movie, but that's on my list as well. Pulp Fiction's on my list. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is definitely on this list, and I'm happy to share this with you guys. This was really a great motherfucker of a movie. It was excellent for the horror genre. It deserves a place in horror history. But it's one of those movies that's it's a little sad in a way, because it's almost like once you watch it, you know what happens, really. The first time is always it's just like sex. The first time is always the best time when you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After it, since you know how it plays out, really, it doesn't feel as special, but it's still worth revisiting. And I'm happy to give my thoughts and analyze it. It's a hell of a motherfucker of a great film, and I'm happy that I watched it.